Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Employer Briefing. These monthly briefings address COVID pandemic-related updates and other developments affecting our society, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as key judicial, legislative, and policy changes. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future employer briefings. I want to address some preliminary items before we begin. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will address the latest developments affecting employers operating during the COVID pandemic, the newest challenges employers are facing as part of the broad-based focus on discrimination in America, and key legal and federal agency developments. The presenters are FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Valerie, and welcome everyone. And Nita and Bert, it's great to see you again also.
Thanks for having us.
Certainly has been a very, very eventful series of weeks since we were last together with everyone. Let's go through some of our preliminary slides so we can move right into some of our materials. First, just a brief word about who we are. We obviously are a law firm. We're a DC-based law firm. We do represent and counsel employers on a wide range of matters relating to the workplace, particularly focusing on the federal agencies, the usual suspects, the Labor Department, the National Labor Relations Board, EEOC, as well as a variety of state agencies also. Our attorneys, and well represented on this call, include those with extensive both private sector experience, as well as government experience. And of course, although we are attorneys and we're primarily addressing a number of legal related developments, the purpose of today is informational, and it's to assist employers in staying abreast of the many current developments, particularly focusing on the legal related developments. But we would encourage each of you as employers to ensure that you receive specific advice on a privilege basis from an attorney who is familiar with your particular circumstances and can do so, provide that advice on fact-specific basis and a privilege basis. All right. Well, let's turn to what we want to spend today talking about. Unfortunately, Justice Ginsburg, as we all know, passed Friday evening, so we do want to take a moment and share some thoughts on her, as well as discuss that change in the landscape. Once again, another change in the landscape that is affecting both the election and a variety of policy as well as political debates and developments that do affect employers. Then we want to talk about the latest in the COVID-19 related developments, which continue to challenge employers nationwide, globally, also, and what's going on there. Social unrest issues and started by marked with the Black Lives Matter movement continues, and there are significant developments relating to the workplace that we want to make sure you're aware of. And finally, the federal agencies. They remain extremely active, and there have been a number of important regulatory as well as other enforcement changes that have occurred. So we have a huge amount of ground to cover. And
right.
I think that it's not what has happened. We probably should say what has not happened since we last met. But let's move right into that. And Nita, do you want to lead off our discussion, please?
Well, I have to say, one of the saddest things that happened Friday night was to hear that Ruth Bader Ginsburg finally was unable to overcome her cancer. 87 years old, an icon for women, an icon for liberals, and something we really hoped would not happen at this point. I have to tell you a quick story. My granddaughter, who's 11, loved loved Ruth Bader Ginsburg, went to see her documentary, went to see the movie, and was Ruth Bader Ginsburg for Halloween last year. She burst into tears hearing that she had died. And I think we'll talk about the political in a minute, but I am so sad to think that in her dying moments, her biggest concern was who would replace her. I just think that is so sad, but she was a lion for a little tiny person. And so I remember her with great, great fondness.
Permit me to add my own. I happen to know Justice Ginsburg largely through her support of the arts in Washington. So this is both a national and a personal loss. But we have to remember Justice Ginsburg as someone who was respected even by people who didn't agree with her.
Mm-hmm.
She is, but more importantly, in a solely legal framework, she is one of the handful of justices that had a genuinely significant impact on shaping the law of the land. I don't think it is too much to say that her role in advancing the law of gender equality is easily on a par with that of Thurgood Marshall with respect to race. I think another thing we have to remember about Justice Ginsburg, especially over the past few years, is that she was a great dissenter. And it made her perhaps the most respected voice in America for a broader role of government in support of the displaced, the overlooked, the outsiders. Her notion of equal justice of the law for every person, as said in the 14th Amendment. Every person gets equal treatment under the law, and that was the focus of her entire jurisprudence. But as more of us, as we'll be talking in a moment, face the problems caused by fire and flood and disease, it is certain that her dissents, speaking for broader support by the government for individuals in need, will very likely become the guidepost for the future shape of the law, and that she will join Justice Harlan, Justice Holmes, and Justice Brandeis as one of the great dissenters in the history of the court. But as Nita pointed out, it seems to me that, frankly, her most profound and lasting impact may be as a role model for a generation of girls. Justice Ginsburg's unsought notoriety, the notorious RBG, something she never dreamed of, has brought a vivid awareness of possibility to a generation of women and girls. Her ubiquitous presence on social media made her position as an unashamedly smart, unashamedly tenacious, unashamedly outspoken woman in a professional role, made her a genuine social icon. And, you know, what other Supreme Court justice has had Halloween costumes made for them? But there's something more to remember.
I love that.
It is certain that many of those girls in their Halloween RBG costumes will be heard in the schoolrooms, in the courtrooms, and the boardrooms of America in the future. And that is perhaps her most lasting legacy. It is wonderful to have had her, and very sad that she is gone.
The nature of the court is such that very few of the general population are frankly much aware of who constitutes who is a justice on the court. They may remember that there was some dust-up confirmation proceeding involving one of those justices. Maybe his name was Kavanaugh. But I think most people, if you would walk up and down the street with your mask on, of course, and ask them, a member of the Supreme Court, most would be able to identify Justice Ginsburg. And that, in and of itself, making that entire branch of government so much more relatable, to the point whether the bar, we as lawyers respect her deeply, her abilities and tenacity, her, you know, and I also had the privilege of meeting her. She terrific in person, very humble, and very impressive. But also that the rest of America, I mean, she's the type of person, and her personal story is one that is quite significant. She was a trailing spouse. She went to one of the few that was on the law review of both Harvard and Columbia. She moved to Columbia to follow her husband. It was an old school situation. And of course, she was very transparent about the fact that how many job offers did she get from the law firms that were courting all of her colleagues? Zero, not a single offer. Yet somehow, as demonstrated by her record, she did find a way to make her voice and her views heard and appreciated. And it's a terrific loss. Both, whether you align with her views or not, you certainly can respect deeply the way she conducted herself as part of that institution.
Mm-hmm.
Very important representative of America. So it's a big loss. It's a big loss. Well,
David,
let's talk a little bit. Yeah.
David, one last thing is she and Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, were very, very close.
Yeah.
And the Secretary of Labor had something very sweet to say about her, as I recall.
He did this weekend. If I don't know how many are readers of the Washington Post, but there was an open letter that Eugene Scalia, who currently is serving the country as the Secretary of Labor and is the son of late Justice Scalia, related in detail in a very genuine and open letter, public letter, but very heartfelt, his feelings and his family's feelings for Justice Ginsburg. Interestingly, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia were obviously on very different ends of the spectrum on most legal and policy issues, but they were very close friends. Very close friends. The families spent New Year's Eve together, numerous New Year's Eve. So the parents knew each other, the children knew each other, etc. And Gene Scalia's commentary really talks about the importance, not that it muddled their views at all. They with tenacity, both Scalia and Ginsburg fearlessly held on to their views, but they really respected and understood each other. And so we don't have to compromise our views by allowing ourselves to talk civilly and have those kinds of great exchanges and to focus on what they had in common, which was, among other things, opera and love of family and food and things like that. So there's a lot of aspects to the notorious RBG, as she's become known, that are worth remembering. So it would have been remiss for us to have not taken a moment to do that, because I think she's something that worth all of our time to think about. All right. Well, let's talk another aspect of Justice Ginsburg's death. Of course, it does have an impact. And it has immediately begun to change the campaign. It began over the weekend and has continued. We have seen the focus where there's been a lot of focus, principally but not exclusively by the Republicans, on the importance of the party in power that controls the White House and the Senate to be able to name and confirm judges. President Trump at this point has confirmed approximately 25% of the federal bench. If he has the opportunity to name Justice Ginsburg's replacement, that would be 3 Supreme Court justices. That is almost unprecedented in a single term to have that many opportunities, but that is the way the events have occurred. So obviously the campaign itself, and we were talking before, I think it's certainly going to amp up the interest on all sides to participate. The published reports on fundraising we were talking about 30 million that the Democrats have, 30 plus million over the weekend directly as a result of this. And trust me, there will be those on the other side who view this as such an incredible opportunity to change the balance on the court in a way that far extends for a generation beyond whether President Trump is or is not reelected. I think that one of the other things that I just wanted to focus on for a moment is the senatorial campaigns, because again, both sides have new energy. The Republicans, to some degree, at least the president, I think, is happy not to be talking about COVID. He'd rather talk about pretty much anything else, so that's occurring. But there have already been, to refresh people, there is a 3-vote margin in the Senate, 53 to 47 in terms of Republican versus Democrat. Assuming a party line vote, if 3 Republicans, even on a process point, say that they do not want to vote pending the election, and we have 2 that have so indicated so far, Senators Collins and Murkowski. So that's Maine and Alaska represented in that. If we have a 3rd, though, that would only result in a tie. And going back to high school civics classes, the president pro temp of the Senate is the vice president, and I think we can anticipate that Vice President Pence will vote in support of a nominee. So from the Democrats, they actually need to change 4 Republicans to at least have them abstain or not participate in the vote. The most likely candidates beyond the 2 that have been identified so far would be Senator Romney, Senator Grassley, Chuck Grassley, who has indicated in fairly recent, not after Justice Ginsburg's death, but shortly before, that he didn't think at this point there should be a vote on that. And Cory Gardner from Colorado, who I'm sure is a bit of a weather vane trying to figure out, is this going to help or hurt me? He's in a dogfight to see if he can be reelected. But those are the key ones that I think that we see now. But Bert, there's another aspect I know that you've identified.
It has to do with the arcana of American federalism. Senator McSally from Arizona lost in her senatorial campaign a few years ago, but was appointed to fill Senator McCain's seat. She is running and trailing Mark Kelly, the astronaut, for the Senate seat. The election will be held on November 3rd, but because of the nature of that election, the winner of that election can be seated as soon as November 30th, right after the certification of the election. So if you're Mitch McConnell, who does nothing better than count days and count votes, if Senator Romney joins Collins and Murkowski in saying this is the wrong time to do this, or I'd like to delay till after the election, or whatever, if McConnell is counting heads, he will probably want to get a vote in before November 30th, because Kelly would be the 4th vote, and that would take it away from the vice president.
Finally, just in terms of when the vote occurs, whether we can get a vote would be one of the most accelerated schedules. I personally think Senator McConnell is more than capable of accelerating the schedule and calling for a vote before the election. If the vote does not occur before the election, however, then there would be the possibility for what's called the lame duck, which is a Congress that sits, in this case, it would be for the period post-election till the end of the calendar year. And potentially members of the Senate, some of whom may no longer be in office after they leave, including, for example, Senator Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, and others who are not running for re-election, whose terms will end January 2nd when the new Congress is sworn in. But all of those folks would still be eligible to vote in this lame duck session. So that scenario of, if the president is reelected, there are 2 situations for lame duck. The president's been reelected, in which case it's fairly easy to predict that the Republican majority in the Senate will confirm the Trump nominee. On the other hand, if the president has not been reelected, then we have a lame duck session with Republicans perhaps really scrambling and potentially causing great concern and upset among the population generally about whether that is fair to do that. It's constitutional, but whether it's fair and will be supported by the public in that situation, a lame duck with Trump as an outgoing president, remains to be seen. Well,
and looming behind all of this, of course, is President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland in the last 10 months of his term. and Senator McConnell refusing even to hold a hearing on the grounds that during the last year of her presidency, the Senate should not act on a Supreme Court nominee. So there's this aura of hypocrisy and change of position behind it all.
We can look at Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham, showing the great political gymnast that he has become in contorting his stated positions and views unabashedly. So that is going to, in terms of what Congress is going to be doing, these issues now are going to consume a lot of energy. They're going to affect the campaign. The question is whether they will be enough to take the eye off of COVID and some of the other issues. We have our first presidential debate in 8 days from today. We have the election in 43 days from today. So we're going to have clarity on these issues reasonably soon. This is the first significant kind of unanticipated event, and it's having a big impact so far and will continue. All right, Juanita, let's talk a little bit about some of the other COVID-related developments, because those too, of course, continue to pace fairly rapidly.
Well, let's just look, if we can look at the next slide, let's talk a little bit about, we are on the verge of 200,000 deaths with COVID, which is astonishing. When you think about, we just had September 11, we lost less than 4,000 people. I know it was a very terrible thing, and the two towers came down, but that was less than 5,000 people. Look at this number, almost 200,000 people. And David, when we were talking on Friday, you pointed out 3 cities, any of which would be wiped out if 200,000 people in that city died. Salt Lake City being the one that most comes to mind. And I think this continues to go up and down. I don't know if you all have been seeing this, but they'll get the numbers down, and then if you look at today, you look at September, and it kind of dropped, and now it's picked back up again. I suspect this is a Labor Day weekend issue here, where people went out and about, partied, and so forth, and now it's kicking back up. One last thing I wanted to mention, just to show you University of North Carolina, where I went to college, was supposed to play football on Saturday, their first game. It was canceled because of COVID. A number of teams in the NFL had many players that were unable to play because of COVID-19. So it is continuing to affect everyday life for people. And so, David, as we talk about that, let's talk about where we are with COVID relief. And as we change to that slide, I just want to make one point before you guys jump in, is that the relief that President Trump provided through his executive order is expiring. That was a 6-week, $300 extra per week for unemployment. That is about to expire. So with that in mind, David, where are we on relief for individuals who are not employed?
Right.
I can pick up here. If you'd like, David, I can pick up here, talk about Congress particularly. Frankly, everyone was expecting, and I think this was an almost universal expectation. Everybody was expecting that Congress would come together before Labor Day to try to get some kind of an increased benefit, extension of loan programs, extension of various other supplemental unemployment, because the unemployment data is still staggering, 30 million unemployed, many people losing health care as a result. But it didn't happen. There was chaos within the Republican caucus. There were at least 20 Republican senators who said, we've already done enough and no more is needed. And beside, a vaccine is coming. I've just heard it from the White House. But and the Democrats stayed very, very stiff. They wouldn't come down past, I think, $2.2 trillion in benefits. In response, the Republicans backed away from $1 trillion to $700,000 for whatever reason. Both parties shamefacedly failed to pass even a skinny relief measure, and it remains to be seen whether the pressures of the campaign on Senators Gardner, on Senator Collins, on Senator Graham, yield a new effort to try to get some relief before the election or even during the lame duck session, because the populace is quite needy. We can't overlook that. The payroll tax relief that President Trump suggested is not being picked up by anyone much beyond the federal government. As Nita pointed out, the supplemental unemployment benefit, which was not even picked up by all the states, is probably exhausted by now, so that there are millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen who are facing rather severe winters with limited financial backing, facing homelessness because of the eviction moratoriums not being as effective as thought. So the political pressures of all of these things may force our Congress back together. But as David just pointed out, there are distracting events occurring.
Major.
And don't forget, all of the House and 1/3 of the Senate is desperate to get out of town to run for re-election. So
that's correct. They don't want to be there. And you know, the other thing is, and this is not unusual at this point, but the White House continues to veer off on its own vector. The Republican Senate was generally, we're worried about the debt. We're not going to keep expanding these programs. We're not going to keep underwriting these so-called blue states that they believe have mismanaged themselves, and they don't want to be a bailout. That political argument's going. In the meantime, about 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, Trump, sort of out of left field, said, well, we got to give people bigger checks than before. So you even have the Steve Mnuchin, Donald Trump wing of the White House versus Mark Meadows as chief of staff, which is an original Tea Party person who is really amping up. So even with that, so it's fairly chaotic. I think at this point, unless and until the political pressure is greater than it has been, and that would really turn on whether Biden can use this failure to get a bill to his advantage sufficiently. I don't think that we're going to see movement on this. The other thing that we don't want to lose sight of here, we're going to move on in just a second here, is the budget. The federal fiscal year, in between all these other things, this normally would be all we're talking about. We aren't even talking about the federal fiscal year ends September 30th. On September 30th, unless there's a new budget, there will be a shutdown. That has already occurred. Recall how chaotic that was. The budget has largely been worked on by the House. It's been given to the Senate, and not much attention's been paid to it. So we either have to have a continuing resolution, or the Senate, in addition to dealing with whether there's going to be a COVID bill, and in addition to dealing now with potential confirmation issues for the Supreme Court justice, oh, by the way, we also need a budget for fiscal year 2021. And I'm assuming no one is going to allow a default to occur, but it's not real clear how that's going to occur, how that's going to be fixed. We have 9 days left to get that piece figured out. So, and since it did happen before during this president's term, it's possible. It definitely is possible. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the some of the other developments. Bert, do you want to do this?
Yeah. Folks, you may recall that one of our lead stories a mere month ago had to be about a judge invalidating the regulations under the First Family Relief Act, which gave opportunities for extended leave and extended care. A judge invalidated the bulk of those in very stark terms. The Department of Labor responded with amazing alacrity. I mean, we're talking between August 3rd and last week, or even 2 weeks ago, by rewriting the regulations in light of the judge's decision. Although they only did so partially, and I think that tells us something about where the administration is heading and what the Department of Labor at least thinks. The main provision that was changed had to do with the definition of healthcare providers. Healthcare providers were exempted from getting all of the leaves and all of the benefits but the definition was extraordinarily broad. It got in cleaners, it got in clerks, it got in lawyers and administrators. That has been changed so that the new regulation, which became effective 5 days ago, limits the exemption of healthcare providers for those who are actually providing care. That is to say, people who give diagnostic services, preventative services, treatment, and other services related to patient care. So that one is pretty safe and pretty secure in its new form. The Labor Department, on the other hand, pushed back. One of the other provisions was the original regulation that was invalidated said you could only get these benefits about being away from work if there was actually work available. Now, that's a common sense rule, but it was not in keeping with the text of the statute, as the judge pointed out. The Labor Department is insisting that that is still a valid criterion and attempted to explain its position in terms of the language of the statute and the language of the FMLA upon which the FFCRA was based. It did the same thing with another provision which required that an employer consent to intermittent leave. And under the ADA and the FMLA, that is not required. So they attempted again to try to focus the judge and whoever on the way in which this requirement is in fact related to and a rational interpretation of the FMLA. The fourth requirement had to do with the nature of records, not terribly important, but fine-tuned in light of the judge's ruling. It remains to be seen, from my point of view, to be quite candid, whether this new rule will be challenged or not, because these three positions were directly invalidated by the court. And that raises a kind of couple of other interesting questions. By the DOL's response, it told us that they thought that even though this was a single judge in the Southern District of New York, that this ruling had national implications. That's important for things we'll be talking about later today. The other thing it raises is, how do you deal with this? If you were laid off, for example, because you had to stay home and weren't given the exemption, and now you're included in those who are eligible for relief, do you have a claim for back pay, for reinstatement? There are a lot of things that have to be worked out here, but basically we have a incredibly fast response from the Department of Labor that only partially accepts the judge's ruling and digs in its heels on others. And I think this may be a kind of preview of the relationship between the courts and the administration on a number of these COVID-related issues. Sorry to take
David,
so long.
I think you're on mute. David, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. This new rule, as Bert indicated, is in effect now. It's an interim final, which means that they can put it right into place now. All these regulations expire December 31st.
Right.
And I agree with Bert, a judicial challenge, since there was not total acquiescence to the ruling of the Southern District of New York. And having talked to some of the lawyers who are representing those interests that challenge this, I think a new challenge is highly likely. So uncertainty, even though we have a new regulation for the moment, I think we're likely to see that challenged very quickly. The regulation is there, the site's there in the Federal Register. Anyone who's not familiar with it, encourage you to take a look at it. All right, well, let's keep looking at some of the additional legal challenges that we're facing. And these are something that Nita, you have talked a good bit about and indicated would be coming, and your crystal ball is, unfortunately for employers, shaping up to be accurate.
Well, I think there's, right now, primarily the types of suit we're seeing. First of all, I want to step back just for 1 second. Prior to Justice Ginsburg's death, we were going to talk a little bit about some survey data that the chamber had done. And what the survey data found is, in order for people, 53% of the surveyed people are afraid of getting COVID. And I think we need to look at that as far as people returning to work and things returning to normal. So keep that in mind as we look through this. You've got public nuisance lawsuits that are being filed because OSHA has not, people do not feel OSHA has effectively stepped up to protect them. And so you're seeing one of the interesting ones is the McDonald's in Chicago is one. Lots of warn suits, because if you started laying people off some period after the COVID started, we've got big lawsuits filed for the layoff. Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which is here in St. Louis, headquartered here, they have a huge lawsuit because clearly people aren't renting cars because people aren't traveling. And there's a big lawsuit from a number. Lots of OSHA claims. You're starting to see a lot of OSHA citations being issued, especially around the meat packers. I will say that $15,000 when someone dies does not seem like a very big citation, but that at least is occurring. So what you're seeing in, there's been some surveys about the type of legislation you're seeing, a litigation going on. It's disability discrimination, workplace safety, leave laws like Bert was just talking about. People are filing suit over that. Retaliation and whistleblowers, and warn, obviously, both federal and state. Now, in response to that, you're seeing states, we have at least a dozen so far, that are enacting various types of liability protection. We've talked in the past about Congress doing that. They have not done that. So most recently, Ohio put one in, but like the same problem we have with other state laws, whether pay bias laws or others, they're all over the map. And that does not encourage people to step out and go to restaurants or to go back to work. So those are issues. In fact, there's a big push on Wall Street to get people back in the workplace, and yet Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Barclays have all had to close down their trading floors and put a bunch of people back working from home and in quarantine because the COVID, they can't control the COVID. The COVID, as Dr. Fauci keeps saying, cycle. The virus will decide.
Excuse me, okay, I'm going to try to cut down some background noise here. Excuse me for a sec.
Okay.
Anyway, so
keep plowing ahead.
Yeah. So with that in mind, David, was there anything else before we jump on to Black Lives Matter?
No, I think that, well, I just would say that this uncertainty, and this is circular. I mean, you started with the point that over half the population is concerned and afraid. We have employers facing challenges in getting people to come back to work, looking for legal safe harbors or ability to not risk, whether it's from customers, employees. Well, the more they talk about that, then people say, well, it must be unsafe. If you're afraid of getting sued, it must still be a problem. And then you force people back in, and then you have this. So we're finding, and I think we're going to see a spike in OSHA claims coming up. OSHA's got 6 months to look at these. We're going to talk about that a little later downstream here. So I think that the legal landscape for employers, particularly those that are trying to get their employees back in the workplace, is proving very challenging. All right, Nita, we're a little behind, but let's move into Black Lives Matter and some of those developments.
Well, I think
change topic a little bit.
We're going to change topics to something, and let's go to the next slide. Something that was really interesting. The Friday before Labor Day, OMB issued a memo based on a request from the president that the agency stop their sensitivity training, that there were this so they said that it was un-American and that the agencies are directed to begin to identify all contracts related to any training on critical race theory, white privilege, or any other training, or this is from the OMB memo, propaganda effort that teaches or suggests that the United States is inherently racist or evil, that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil, and so forth. And this is, they're to cancel all such contracts from these un-American propaganda training sessions. So this is a move by the administration, which may, as was pointed out, some of it's based on the New York Times 1619 project, which looks at American history from the African American perspective. And I think that it's very interesting to see this as a response to BLM and other things, around that. And I think we're going to watch
also,
this.
Nita, I think it focuses on implicit bias too, and takes issue with
correct
training that assumes or recognizes implicit bias. Bert, comment?
This follows on the heels of, and I'm sure it's related to the revelation in Bob Woodard's book, where the president was asked if he even thought that there was something like systemic racism in the country and discrimination, and he said, "Wow, you've really drunk the Kool-Aid."
You've really drunk the Kool-Aid.
And this happened within 3 days.
So the memo that Nita just talked about was issued Labor Day weekend. I mean, it did not get any meaningful attention, but it is binding on the federal agencies and will necessitate an immediate recalibration of the training along the lines that Nita described. Nita, do you want to hit that second point with respect to the other executive memo?
Yes, and completely on a different subject, but they're OMB directing the agencies to, I think relax might be a little bit strong a word, but basically to look carefully at their enforcement of regulations and to lighten litigation, basically according to Section 6 of the Executive Order 13924, which really was to restart the economy. And it's called the regulatory relief to support the economic recovery. But the idea is that they want I think the most interesting part is they want any time that there's an ambiguity in the law or regulation, that it be interpreted in favor of the regulated party. And also the other important thing, I think, David and Bert, is the fact that it is to be that the political appointees are to make these decisions. They're not necessarily to take direction from the enforcement staff. Any other thoughts on that, David?
So let me just two quick points, because I want to keep moving here. First, the Labor Department found that a federal contractor violated its obligations because it failed to have affirmative action on behalf of white males, who, I mean, the regulations in the history, nearly 55-year history of that program have never been read as providing that. That was a rather shocking result, and one that is totally contrary to the general federal contractor community understanding. Finally, we see lots of indicia that the administration continues to prioritize the protection of religious rights. Some are worried that it's succumbing other rights, that it's sort of an overprotection, if you will. But I think that the key takeaway, when you look at all of these trends, all of which are within the last 30 days we're talking about here,
right,
suggests that this administration is on a course with respect to some of these issues that's very different than the way that most of corporate America looks at EEO, affirmative action, in a very favorable way, and particularly post with the advent of the Black Lives Matter social movement, actually expanding the efforts and broadening the footprint and trainings and so forth. And yet we have the administration veering off in a very different direction, one that's in tension, certainly, with what the corporate community is generally doing. All right. Well, Bert, let's talk a little bit about other developments in the workplace. Next slide. Yep.
Bert, you're on mute.
Cannot hear you. Sorry.
You know, that old expression of the road to hell and good intentions, and how we get caught up in our best feelings. A number of companies chafing under the criticism, particularly that their boards and their leadership is kind of lily white and Ivy League, announced very formally that over the next years they intended to hire 20% of their new hires to be African Americans, to try to create a balance so there'd be more representative workforce. And it struck all of us when we read that going back to the early days of affirmative action, and you might remember in California the constitutional amendment barring affirmative action, the effort to identify a fixed number of hiring is easily characterized and easily diminished and easily challenged as an attempt to create a quota. I am certain that the intent of Wells Fargo, Target, and others was to expand their recruiting so that they have a larger, broader base of people to choose from, because there is no doubt that you could vastly increase the numbers of minorities in your workforce simply by looking harder, and rather than going to the Ivy League and the Seven Sisters, you could go to the HCBUs and places like that.
Yeah,
that you can expand your workforce.
Right. This is a problem that we're seeing that corporate America generally is moving from aspirational targets to firm numbers that in fact are quotas and potentially unlawful. So, all right. Well, how about on the corporate boards, Needham? How are we doing there? Because there have been further efforts there.
Well, there was an article in New York Times, which we have the link there. The numbers from the boards, which they have control over, is terrible. You have 40% of the population and only 12.5% of the 12.5% of the members of corporate boards are Black or some other ethnicity. It's only up from 10% in 2015. So it's only gone up 2.5% total. And African Americans were 4% in this year, up from 3% in 2015. So very little progress is being made. African American women, it's only up 1.5%. So the numbers are terrible. There is a board challenge by 44 executives and institutions to add one Black director to every board in the next 12 months. The only group that seems to have made any progress are women, and I think that's partially some of these directives we've seen out there from California and other places. Women were in 2015 were 13%, they're 21%. So at least they're up some. But these numbers are terrible considering how long this has been an issue since the early 90s to add individuals of color and women to executive boards.
Yes, the other thing to remember, there's no law here. The boards can choose their members willy-nilly. There's no, they don't have to meet any standard, no affirmative action. They can name anybody they want, and they haven't.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. This is, I think there's going to be much greater accountability. One of the consequences of the current focus in social movement is going to be accountability up and down the chain, including corporate boards. And honestly, as Bert says, this is something that can be addressed pretty easily and pretty quickly if the desire is there to do so. So I think that's an opportunity, as we say. All right. Well, let's talk a little. Let's change the subject again and cover a little bit about some of the agencies, because they also have been quite busy. Bert, do you want to take the first slide on this one?
Yeah, indeed. Again, you might recall I mentioned this ongoing battle between the administration and the courts. The Department of Labor issued a joint employer regulation, which was supposedly to create clarity and certainty by identifying 4 imposed factors, mainly reducing to who's in charge of the day-to-day operations, who directs, who hires, who fires, who disciplines, who pays. And many people, myself included, thought that the DOL had done it right. A New York judge disagreed. It's a very technical decision written in the language of the Administrative Procedures Act, said that the Fair Labor Standards Act used broader definitions. Frankly, the judge thought that the Obama interpretation was better, but that's been rescinded. It is not even available. And invalidated the DOL joint employer regulations. 2 things to remember. Wage and Hour Division has already said it's going to stand behind its rule, that it, contrary to the prior FFCRA, it says this is only a New York judge and we don't care what she has to say. And the other thing to remember is that there are other joint employer regulations that are significant. The Wage and Hour Division has its own opinion letter, which may be on tenuous grounds now, but is still there. More significantly, the NLRB has an independent joint employer rule, and for Justice for Janitors, for McDonald's, that's the really important one because it bars unfair labor practices and it will not process petitions for unionization. So this is Chapter 114 and the longest continuing battle of any labor issue in the United States, going back to the Browning-Ferris decision 5 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. And it hasn't stopped, and stay tuned. There's going to be more on joint employer.
Right. This is very important. And joint employer can be both vertical and horizontal. And this
Yep.
ruling really invalidates the rules in the more typical vertical. So you have a host employer and you have subordinate contractors on site. And the question is whether the host employer also can be held liable. We actually have a client that just approached us this morning with a litigation issue exactly on these issues. So this is a very critical issue, and there will continue to be significant litigation on this. So, and Bert's point on whether this is nationwide or not is critical. All right, Nita, OFCCP has not exactly been asleep at the switch either, have they?
Not at all. On Monday, a week ago, they issued, well, actually the Friday before, so over a week ago Friday, they issued new CSALs, which are to notify people that they're going to be on the list for an audit. There were 251. Then on Monday, they issued a revised list. We have new kinds of audits. We've got promotion audits, accommodation audits, which we have not had in the past. And as part of that, we do not have scheduling letters yet. The most important issue, I think, is that OFCCP is using OSHA and wage and hour citations as a factor in the selection of who is going to be on the list. I think that's going to be very interesting if we continue with a Trump administration, whether that continues. But it's backdoor blacklisting, as you call it, David, I believe. That was a very interesting point right there. But I think
it seems contrary
to
the executive order you just talked about. It seems contrary to the order to relax litigation.
That is an interesting point. We can talk about that in just a second. I know we're running short on time, so I don't want to spend too much time. But David, I did want to mention the proposal for AAP verification. As part of the Institute for Workplace Equality, we've been very involved in encouraging OFCCP to look into an annual certification by so that OFCCP would focus their audits on those employers who should be focused on, and not have the employers who are doing things correctly continually having to have audits. That proposal was issued last Monday. There will be comments, and they're basically quickly 3 different options that they would certify once a year and submit their AAPs only when they get an audit. They would certify, or secondarily, they would certify once a year and upload their AAPs annually. And third, they would simply certify every 2 years. We've got a couple of other things going on: finalization of their religious freedom regulations, lots of settlements, including a $3 million one by Microsoft that was just issued. And for higher ed, there's a new FAQ on campus-wide AAPs. David, you want to mention that really quickly before we go on to the EEOC?
Yeah, this is interesting. It sort of snuck into this announcement about the future audits coming up, and it said, oh, by the way, for higher ed, your AAP has to be campus-wide, and this is a technical but a significant regulation. Every other supply and service contractor does it by establishment, which is traditionally a bricks and mortar identity, an address. Mm-hmm. What the agency has said, without rulemaking, without complying with the Administrative Procedure Act, with no opportunity for comment and no acknowledgement that the regulations authorize higher ed as supply and service contractors to use establishment, to say no, that it must be campus-wide. Bert.
Bert, we can't hear
I'm
you
sorry,
because
Bert, you're on mute.
on mute.
All right. So
All I
we're
was
going
to just say, as you pointed out, it's contrary to the regulation.
Correct. All right. Well, let's dip into the sister sibling agency for OFCCP, which is EEOC, which also has some significant developments today. The Senate is scheduled by unanimous consent to confirm the slate of nominees to commissioners, which would be the first time during the Trump administration that the EEOC would be up to full complement of 5. You see the listings there of the nominees, 2 Republican, 1 Democrat. This also means many of you know Vicki Lipnick. It will mean that her term will end when these new commissioners come on board. And so Commissioner Lipnick her services with EEOC will end after a very long reign. But we're very excited about these new nominees. They're very qualified, and I think I know the chair will welcome having a full complement on the commission, including 3 Republicans to go forward with. Bert, do you want to address the updated COVID guidance that the commission issued briefly?
Yeah, there really wasn't a great deal to be said here, but the main thing that the EEOC wanted to clarify, it had been very expansive in urging employers to grant accommodations to people who had any COVID-related incident in their household or their children were home from school. But they wanted to make sure, and this is clearly in line with the White House, that they wanted to make sure that once people start coming back to work, that just because you let people telework during the crisis, you do not have to continue that accommodation absent pressing needs. So they are trying to encourage employers to recognize pressing needs, but on the other hand, relieving them of the regulatory requirement to provide an accommodation of remote work when the employer no longer believes it is necessary. Somewhat controversial.
Finally,
depends to be see how it works out.
Right.
Please.
Finally, in kind of a mixed bag for employers, the commission has issued an opinion letter, very favorable for employers. These are kind of unusual critters in contrast to Wage Hour, which issues opinion letters with some frequency. EEOC rarely does, and a favorable one, narrowing pattern and practice litigation claims, favorable for employers' interests. On the other hand, not so favorable to employers. The agency is amping up and demonstrating a willingness to bring expanded litigation both under religious freedom issues and a kind of a new chapter in the Age Discrimination Act following a Supreme Court case recognizing pattern and practice claims. Now the EEOC has brought a very highly publicized claim. IBM is on the receiving end of this one, systemic age case. So though EEOC, but I think the real headline, most important headline is full commissioners, but the agency in substance continues to move quite aggressively. All right, let's quickly dip into the some of the other actions at the other agencies. Just quickly, Wage Hour does have 4 new opinion letters. Most important is fluctuating work week. And by the way, that is a really important for anyone that uses fluctuating work week. Please take a look at that opinion letter. It provides a legal safe harbor for you under the FLSA, so it's important to use. Finally, the independent contractor rule that's widely anticipated is at the White House, waiting approval. We're very confident that's going to issue probably within the next 30 days, and we'll move forward. And litigation likely will. I mean, the pattern that we have seen will continue. My bet would be it'll be challenged in the Southern District of New York.
Of New York.
They've cut the groove pretty well there. And finally, OSHA. There's 6 months after OSHA does an investigation, and so some of the situations that were investigated primarily in healthcare and meatpacking, there are a growing number of citations now that are being issued there, and you can anticipate there will be more activity on OSHA as things move forward. So OSHA, I think we're going to see an uptick. Time doesn't allow us to spend much more time on that today, but that's what we have. So it's been it's been really busy. Let's hit with a couple of takeaways. Bert,
Okay.
you want to start?
As we said, the political calculus has been upended by the death of Justice Ginsburg as a political as well as a judicial figure. The role of the Supreme Court in our country is vast and will be a strong political issue.
Nita.
Move.
We got lots of room for improvement for the corporate response to the BLM, as we saw from the board of directors, and I think many employers need to think hard about what they choose to do to avoid getting into Title VII problems. David?
Agreed. And finally, yeah, both the federal agencies and the courts are not shying away. It may be an election season, and it may be an amped up election season with Justice Ginsburg and the Supreme Court vacancy creating greater interest from all stakeholders. But the agencies and courts continue apace, and it's going to be brisk. So I think this is a time for employers. There really was no summer or August recess in any sense,
Right.
and the pace is going to accelerate in the next month or so. So I think it's going to be very, very fulsome. All right. Well, let's note that our next briefing is going to be October 19th. Obviously, if events warrant, we will put a special briefing on in very short order, as we've done in the past. So with that, Valerie, I'll ask you to close us out and thank both Bert and Nita today.
Thank you, everybody.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, all registrants from today have been registered for future briefings, and you may view this briefing as well as our previous COVID-19 weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. The next monthly briefing will be October 19th. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.